Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. It's called Food Identity on a Label, State of the Art and Perspectives in Western Canada. This is the first of two webinars this month brought to you by the European Union, and I would like to start by thanking them for hosting and for organizing and for the opportunity for me to moderate this panel on such an interesting and timely topic. These webinars are focused on producers with the goal to raise awareness about the benefits of food identity labeling in exports, sustainable development, and traceability. The first webinar will be focused on policy awareness and raising policy awareness amongst producers here in British Columbia and in Alberta. The second webinar will gather various producers with geographical indications and with other labels to discuss more hands-on approaches to food identity and labeling. And the second webinar is taking place on May 20th. Similar webinars are being held across Canada. The topic of protecting geographical indications is gaining momentum in Canada. Consumers are becoming more sophisticated and paying attention to the geographical origins of a product, and they crave more authenticity and care more about specific characteristics of the products that they buy. And in some cases, the place of origin suggests to consumers that the product will have a particular quality or characteristic that they may value, and often consumers are prepared to pay more for such products. Producers and governments, they play a role in the development of specific markets for products with certain characteristics linked to their place of origin, and geographical indications convey this information about the origin-bound characteristics of a product and can be a key element in developing brands for quality bound to origin products. So today, our panel, we will focus on policy questions like, why should we think about GIs? Why should producers care about the existence of such a policy regime? And what are the benefits? What should producers be thinking about? Our distinguished panel will provide their expertise on trade and food identity, shedding light on how food identity labeling, such as GIs, can improve the export prospects for Canadian producers. The format will be a panel discussion for 45 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A session after, and we'll be recording the session. I welcome you to ask us questions on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. You should be able to type your questions in the chat field, and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of our session. So we're really fortunate to have these four experts here sharing their perspectives with us. I will be the moderator, and I'll try to keep us on time. We have a lot to share with you today. So let's get started with some introductions of the panel. I'm Janelle Quiring. I work for the BC government. I've worked there for over 25 years. I'm currently a director in international trade in the Trade Policy and Negotiations branch with the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation. I was one of the negotiators for British Columbia in the Canada-EU trade agreement. And so as part of that, I was involved with negotiations on geographical indications as well. I also am very proud to say that I work hard now in making sure that companies are aware of the benefits and advantages of the Canada-EU trade agreement, and I've been spending a lot of my time making sure that companies are aware of the opportunities. So I'm very grateful to be here today to be able to add some to that around geographical indications and what the opportunities may be there for BC companies and BC producers. Joining me as well, I have Benjamin Velen, and he is a policy officer, DG Agriculture with the European Commission. Welcome, Benjamin. He's also an agricultural engineer, and he's graduated from the Institution National Agronomique in Paris in 2001, and he's been working for the European Commission since 2009. As a DG for Ag for the past year, he's been in charge of the implementation in the agricultural field of the CETA. We also have Irene Kabuli. She's a professor of law in Texas with the University School of Texas. She specializes in intellectual property and international trade, fashion and cultural heritage law. She's professor of law at Texas University School of Law, an academic fellow at the School of Law, University of Geneva, and a senior fellow at the Melbourne Law School and Transatlantic Technology Law Fellow, Stanford University. And she regularly acts as an expert for national governments and international organizations, and has recently authored studies and conducted missions for the World Intellectual Property Organization and the EU IP Office, and several national IP offices. Welcome, Irene. Martin Cloutier, he is also a professor at the University of Quebec in Montreal, where he conducts research related to food and the agribusiness management, as well as the area of technological innovation. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he holds a Master's of Science degree in Agricultural Economics from McGill University. His research interests include digital transformation of microenterprises, SMEs, as well as the management, economic, and policy issues pertaining to the agri-food and alcoholic beverage industries. He acts as an expert on economic and business model-related matters for trade associations in the agri-food sector, and analyzes economic implications of policy or regulatory changes for government agencies and ministries in Canada and internationally. Welcome, Martin. And finally, Scott Henenfont. He is the general manager here in BC for the British Columbia Wine Authority. And he's also a chartered professional accountant, and he will explain the experience of the BC Wine Authority and GIs here in British Columbia. And that is welcome, Scott. So really looking forward to hearing what all of my experts have to say on this important topic. So I think we should just get started with the first question. What are geographic indications, Benjamin? Can you please launch us off and get us started on explaining what geographical indications actually are?
Yes, sure, Diana. Thank you for the question. As to geographical indication, probably is not such I mean, it is a concept. It's not easy to necessarily to grasp it. So just to start with, I think probably some of you are right now drinking some tea or coffee. If you're like me, a tea drinker, I have my tea here with me. Maybe you have already had some Darjeeling tea. Right, Darjeeling is a geographical indication. Okay, maybe to introduce the concept and its definition, I will show you this one slide. Basically, to have a geographical indication, according to the international definition in the WTO agreement, you need three things. So yeah, maybe the slide is coming up. So geographical indication, it's basically it's a name, it's a designation, right? Darjeeling it's a name, but behind that name you need three things. First, you need a defined geographical area. So here it could be, for instance, a nice vineyard in Austria, or could be pastures in mountain areas in France, right? So you need a very specific geographical area. Then the second point is you need a very specific product, right? So in the case of this vineyard, well, the product would be a wine, in this case, Wachau wine from Austria, right? Or in the case of the pastures, here you can have a cheese. Here is a French cheese named Comté. Okay, so you have a geographical area, you have a specific product, and the third element you need is a link, a causal link between the geographical area and the product. It could be, for instance, that the specific characteristics of the product, the taste, the color, the smell, whatever, are linked to this very specific geographical area. Or it could be also that the reputation of the product comes from the area. But you need some causal link. Now, if you have the three things, these three elements, then you do have a geographical indication. And in Europe and in many other jurisdictions in the world, you can have it's protected as a geographical indication. Now, if you're in Europe and you have this registered, you have several ways, and this is what's indicated on the right hand side of the slide. Sorry. So if your product is a food or a wine, you could have what we call a protected designation of origin, which if you want is the high end of geographical indications in Europe. It's in that case, all of the ingredients have to come from the geographical area, and you must have very strong causality links between the geographical area and the product. If you have somewhat of a weaker link, you could have still what we call a protected geographical indication. And in those two cases, for food and wine, you have this logo that can be put on the product. If your product is a spirit drink, then you would have basically a geographical indication without any other qualification and without the logo. But that's it, basically how we define geographical indications and how we have this elaborated in Europe.
Thank you, Benjamin. Now we're going to move over to Scott, who will elaborate for us on how wine is different from food in establishing the GIs.
Yeah, hello. I guess the one interesting part of wine is it's got a long history of doing GIs. The first GI was in 1716 in Italy, but it even goes back further than that, where they're identifying certain traits in wines that made those grapes more sought after, and therefore people were willing to pay a higher price for those wines. I think what illustrates the importance of GIs to the wine industry more than anything is really the amount of fraud that's happened in the industry, in the sense that people can see the advantage of putting a different GI on a bottle of wine, which will increase the cost of or increase the price of that wine. And so it just goes to show you that GIs are highly sought after. You can move a product from one area to another, and it can change the impression of the quality, et cetera, that Benjamin mentioned earlier. And so it's important. Truth in labeling is a huge deal in wine, and that's sort of the role of the BC Wine Authority, is to ensure that truth in labeling and the GIs and sub-GIs are properly designated on the labels.
Thank you. And I guess for British Columbia, we have a number of wine regions that are important, as well as sub-regions, so that for British Columbia, for our wine industry in particular, there's a lot of interest and geographical indications around, something like the Okanagan Valley. Of course, we all know, beautiful wines come from the Okanagan Valley and that kind of thing. So thank you for that, Scott. Martin, could you elaborate a bit more as well on what geographical indications are?
Yes, in terms of the geographical indications, I may speak about the experience in Quebec. So the Quebec government has put into place the current legal framework in 2006 for agri-food related protection of IP and to manage and valorize innovations. So this was called the Act Respecting Reserve Designations and Added Value Claims. So the reserve designation and protected geographic indications as a means to protect links with product specificity, for example, methods of production, or terroir dimensions of products. This is the only such framework in North America. Given the program that is put into place, one can expect that there will be continuation, and given recent past intensity in terms of approving various collective IP management frameworks such as this one. And given the current enthusiasm about the aspect having to do with the agri-food economy in the province. It's quite an important element. So the Council of Reserve Designations and Valorized Terms, the CAR-TV, is responsible for the administration of the law, and the Quebec system is very similar in that regard to the EU system. If you look at the slide, what you'll see is that on the left-hand side is the private mode under the federal government of collective valorization of products through certification mark. And the Quebec institution is distinct from that in that it provides reserve terms for PDOs and PGIs, as well as specificity designation and protection of production modes and other valorized terms. So these are two parallel systems, and the one on the right-hand side are the provisions provided by the Quebec government in that act. So there are 4 areas covered by the geographic indications. There's the reserve designation related to the production mode that will include a global production approach to a product. There will be reserve designation related to the specificity relative to a product in the same category, for example, the Canadian cow cheese, and reserve designation related to a terroir, for example, a production region where the product is from, and that has intrinsic product characteristics related to the geographic origin. For example, the ice cider, the ice wine, the Quebec wines, the Neuville sweet corn, as well as, for example, Charlevoix lamb. Now, the scope of actions, very briefly, the purpose is to make sure that products are certified according to specifications related to standards defined by regulation and by a certification body, that a specific applicant group is designated, and the specifications having to do with the certification criteria and principle of traceability, the exclusive right of use, so exclusive right within the open system, and the state or the government is the owner of the designated intellectual property, and therefore not the applicant group. And that is a contrast with the elements that we see on the slide on the left-hand side. And then one of the last elements of that is the public protection with a monitoring program trying to prevent counterfeiting.
Thank you, Martin. That sounds a very good overview. I think next we'll move on to Benjamin. Benjamin, are geographical indications a sole European invention? I guess we've just realized they are not, but because we did hear a bit about the Canadian context so far. But please elaborate on how many you would say there are in other jurisdictions as well as Canada and the EU.
Well, sure. In terms of invention, I don't know. Yeah, I think this is not this slide is not for now. But in terms of invention, I'm not sure who invented. Probably it was invented in Europe, the concept of geographic indication. But I think we don't claim any monopoly on it. On the contrary, actually, it's a concept that is used all over the world. And basically, as I said in my first intervention, the definition that I presented is enshrined actually in property, and therefore actually it's a definition that is agreed by all WTO members, and the WTO agreement actually establishes a basic level of protection for GIs. So certainly not a European monopoly. Now, I think also another thing you can think about is beyond the WTO, there is the World Intellectual Property Organization, which manages a multilateral agreement on geographical indications, which we refer to usually as the Lisbon system, which is basically a multilateral register of GIs, right? So certainly not only the EU. I'm not certain how many geographical indications there are around the world. I'm not sure it would be my role to count them. What I can say for sure is that in Europe, we protect, I think, 1,700 or more of geographical indications which are not from Europe, right? So that, I think that gives already an idea. 1,700. I think it's basically more or less a third of the geographical indications we protect in Europe. There are non-European ones. So that's a lot for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a lot. So I think next we'll move to Irene. Irene, can you explain the difference between geographical indications and trademarks?
So many thanks again for the for you all to organize this seminar. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to those in the field that actually are interested in using geographic indication on an everyday basis. And I'm sure we have in the audience several members of associations that are at the same time either individual entrepreneurs or they belong to a specific, to a specific company, to a specific SMEs. And so when we say the difference between trademarks and geographical indication, let me give you a couple of examples. Champagne and Veuve Clicquot or Dom Pérignon. Dom Pérignon is a type of champagne, is a trademark of a champagne owned by Moët & Chandon, which is in itself another trademark. Veuve Clicquot is another trademark, Tattinger, and we have so many others. But then champagne is the geographical indication that all the members of that specific association can use. There are endless examples. Chianti wine with Antinori, Frescobaldi, and so on. Earlier, Janelle very kindly said I work and teach in the United States, but I am Italian, and I think Italy is the country that has the highest number of geographic indication in Europe, followed by France. And we have, I think also we are first or second in the number of registration at the WIPO for the Lisbon registrations. So I come from a very rich country with tradition of geographical indication. So the difference between a GI and a mark, it's that the mark is the sign that identifies the individual business, the specific company, while the geographic indication identifies the association that is in itself comprised by several individual companies. Now, in addition, we don't only have trademarks, we also have collective marks and certification marks. So now let's see for a second, what is a collective mark? So every geographical indication association tend also to have a collective mark that is owned by the association, because the protection for the geographical indication is for the name, but the logo, the pictorial part of that association, say Consorzio of Parmigiano Reggiano, the famous little logo that has a wheel, or the Chianti Gallo Nero, the little black rooster. These are collective marks that all the members of the association can put on their products. They have to be members of the association owns the collective mark, and then they individually put on their respective product their individual logo and trademarks of their company. Then there are the certification marks. These marks, depending on the jurisdiction where we are, the country where we are, have a different function. The function is similar in some cases to geographical indication. In the United States, for example, we don't have a system of geographical indication as a whole. We are in terms of sui generis, specific way to register geographic indication. We only have that for wine, the so-called viticultural areas. And so, say Parmigiano Reggiano, Champagne, and so other are registered as certification marks. These marks has as part, and they're owned also by the association, and they guarantee a specific quality that include an origin, a geographical origin. I believe that Canada has also the possibility to register certification marks for geographical part. In the European Union, we can't. Before, we did not have certification marks. Some individual countries had them, such as the United Kingdom. But the topic, so the type of mark, certification mark, is now in the latest European directive. And though we cannot have an overlap between a certification mark and a geographical indication. So only, say, Bohemian crystal, things that cannot yet be registered as a GI in the EU can be registered as certification trademark. I don't want to make this too legalistic complicated. I think it's important for the producer, and many of you can be in the audience, to understand that you have your mark, and your mark is your company. It's the sign of goodwill of your company. And at the same time, you are part of an association, and so you share with many other producers in a community of producers, in a consortium very often, the ownership of a geographical indication. Nobody else outside your area can use that. You will, though, keep your individuality in your own company, and so some minor variation, the packaging and other things. So you can still distinguish yourself, but then you as a group with your community can protect yourself against other people trying to free ride on the goodwill of your community. That's why the two are actually, they are very important they need to work together. Geographic indication needs individuals' trademarks as well. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Irene. Benjamin, did you have anything you wish to add to what Irene talked about there?
I think Irene has already explained very well the main differences between trademarks and geographical indications. I have very little to add, but maybe if just I would add one thing is, from a producer perspective, and at least in Europe and other jurisdictions, I know it's not the same in Canada necessarily, one thing that is very important that you get with a geographical indication is strong administrative enforcement provisions. When you have a trademark as a company, you have to defend it all by yourself, right? But if you have a geographical indication collectively, you can rely on, in Europe at least, on the administrative services, and there in all member states they have enforcement services to make sure that the geographical indications are used correctly and not misused by producers that would not have the right to use them. And another point maybe, which is different also between the trademark and geographical indication, is that basically the geographical indication is not transferable, right? It cannot be sold to someone outside the geographical area. So the production cannot be displaced. So this is also something that is, I think, very important to have in mind when you're thinking about geographical indications as a group from a given community. I think that's it from my side. Back to you, Janelle.
Absolutely, that was very helpful. Thank you, Benjamin. Next, on to a little bit more explanation from Irene on something very near and dear to my heart in particular, and so important for British Columbia as well, because we do have a lot of Indigenous communities in British Columbia. And so can you, Irene, elaborate a bit on the key characteristics of geographical indications and that make them of special relevance for Indigenous communities?
So this is a very good point and a very important one, I think. Indigenous community have been struggling to defend their traditional cultural expressions and their traditional knowledge. And the reason why the concept of traditional cultural expression and TK, or even genetic resources, don't easily fit within a system of highly individualistic intellectual property that we have, just in a nutshell, intellectual property is supposed to give an incentive to innovation, so wants to give right to individual entrepreneurs, is very much a creature of a market economy. And so the target is we protect individual action for a limited amount of time, so investor can recover their cost and make profit and reinvest them and then move on and do something else. So this idea of tradition, it's much more difficult to fit. Moreover, traditional community tend to have communal rights. It's not individually owned, it's community owned. It's more difficult to map, and most of these rights very often in a traditional intellectual property context would have been expired. And so it's very hard to make the case we need to protect them, or it's even harder to find a legal instrument to do so. Now, geographic indication don't protect other from copy. So you can do sparkling wine, and the only thing you can't is call it champagne. But the fact that you cannot call it champagne because there is a GI on the champagne name gives that unique sparkling wine an authenticity. So the reason why I make this example is, many people might make crystal. Not many people can. Nobody can make Bohemian crystal. And so there are specific names in this geographical community that identify specific handicraft or specific traditional foods, specific recipes. And so even though the community would like to prevent their use altogether, at least the geographic indication, the community can guarantee a knowledge about the fact that other might copy the technique, might copy the handicraft, but cannot call it with my name. And also, we know now the protection of GI can actually go beyond the name. In Europe, we just had some decision related even to the shapes of certain products, if there is evocation and misuse or misappropriation of them. And so what the geographic indication can give Indigenous community is a tool to assert the communal value and authenticity. And that in many ways ties very closely to this idea of intangible cultural heritage, cultural diversity, it's part of the UNESCO. The only problem is that, Canada, like the United States, tend to be particularly, the Anglo-Saxon part of Canada, a bit more skeptical about some of these more European-based type of doctrine based on tradition, moral rights, rather than efficiency. But I would say, just what's happening within CETA, it's making the role of geographic indication more important. And, the efficientists, I have lots of colleagues in the US are all against geographic indication. They say there are subsidies, but I have no problem in giving a protection to Indigenous community to protect their names, so then nobody can copy those. And so we can make sure they can at least establish the authenticity. So then people might get the replica somewhere else, but they want to have, and they might hopefully want to have the original someday. So this is in a world of conflict about how and if to protect what is dear to this community. It's a sure way to at least protect the names, and with it, some of the techniques can be attracted in the protection. It's really important, though, for this community also to consult with specialists, because this is not an easy area. Geographic indication is actually a very complex area in which there are not that many good specialists. It's not just a do-yourself. It's important to have a well-written book of specification, something that it might need some assistance, perhaps some technical assistance, and I think that's where. This is so nice that you do these exercises with these seminars just to raise awareness. But it's a very important tool for Indigenous community for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Irene. That was a very good overview on that. Our next question, what is the role of producers on one hand and governments on the other when establishing food identity labeling? And for this question, we're going to go around to everyone. We'll start with, back to you, Irene, actually.
I'm going to be very fast on that because I think actually it's more important that Benjamin and the others respond. I think Benjamin already partially mentioned the very important role of government in enforcing geographic indication, because these are sui generis rights that have administration. Producers are very important, particularly in country like Canada or country like Europe, because geographical are very much a community movement in which producer needs to set common standards and a process that has then to be certified, has to be approved through a registration system, and so they have, and then of course then the certification authority in Europe is the DG Agri, and in other jurisdiction depends, might be the IP office, or might be some department of the trade, the commerce of trade, and so on. They provide validation. In some developing countries, particularly, there is a lot of technical assistance from the governments to help producer putting all the application together. And in fairness, the European Union has helped a lot with IP Key, the various IP Key and other European programs helping producer. I live in Asia. I live in Singapore. I've been living in Singapore for many years, and there is a lot of work that has been done in developing countries in Southeast Asia by some of these initiatives that have really helped tremendously local producers. And so this is another area in which technical assistance is very important. Thank you.
Absolutely, Irene. And over to you now, Benjamin.
Well, if you're asking me, I think we each have a role to play, right? At first, I think it starts with, in a way, the governments. The governments have to decide the legal framework for geographical indications. As I said, all the WTO members have agreed to a basic level of protection of geographical indications, but the WTO agreement doesn't say how that should be protected. And many jurisdictions actually have chosen to just have them under traditional IP approach. It's not the approach that we have chosen in Europe. We have what we call a sui generis system, a framework that is specific to GIs. That was a political choice, and I think it's a very relevant choice in geographical indications. I think it works well in Europe, at least. So, and then you decide also as a government the type of enforcement. And again, I cannot insist enough on the importance of the administrative enforcement. But then, of course, when it comes to establishing one particular geographical indication, there is a huge role. You should not deny it for producers. I mean, producers do have to come together, agree that they do have, a main goal. They do have a product. They do have a story to sell with the product collectively, and that needs to be part of a collective plan, really. So this is not always easy, but it's an important role of the producers. As Irene said, of course, government can help, and we're doing that indeed in developing countries, but we're doing that also with our producers. Each member state in Europe does it its own way. There's some help more, some less. But in the end, the government will have a very important role in ensuring that what comes to its table as a request for protection actually corresponds to a geographical indication. So there you have to go back to the definition and make sure that we're within the definition, and then government again has a role when it comes to enforcing these rights. Well, producers also. I mean, you can always keep an eye on the market. It's always very useful. But it's true that so if your geographical indication is thousands of producers or very small producers. Each of them won't have the means to do anything. So again, the role of the government in helping with the enforcement and with the administrative enforcement in particular is very important. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Back to you, Janelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. Martin, do you have anything to offer in terms of the experience in Quebec?
The scope of action of the government is to recognize and maintain the GIs and the reserve terms, to support the various projects that are coming in, to provide information to the public. New applications are publicized and anyone can consult. To provide the surveillance and control of the use of the reserve terms in the GIs, to provide accreditation of the certification bodies that will monitor what's happening in the industry, and to maintain the information system or the archive that looks at the evolution of the geographic indications over time. As to the scope of actions of producers, the idea is to identify a product and to gather interested producers to form an applicant group, for example. Also to prepare a complete file as well as the book of specification to submit to the governing body or council responsible for managing the application, and is also to be proactive and engage with the council in the evaluation process of the application. That would be some complementary elements that I would bring forth. Back to you, Janelle.
Thank you, Martin. And then finally over to Scott. Can we just hear from you a bit about British Columbia context in that?
Yeah, so British Columbia is going through a unique period right now. We're a young wine industry, and actually we're just in the process of setting up a number of sub-GIs, so smaller units in the Okanagan Valley. We've set up 4 sub-GIs so far since I've been around, and we've got about 5 sub-GIs in process right now, actually. And so there's a whole process where the producers propose a sub-GI, and they hire technical experts, so geologists and soil climate people, to write a report supporting that GI that they're after. The producers then have a vote along with the vineyards in the area that are in favor of the sub-GIs, and then they submit it to us and we submit it to the Minister of Agriculture. So at that point, the minister looks at the report and makes sure that they're okay with everything, and they put it in the regulations. So we have wine and mark quality regulations, and the GI is officially recognized within the regulations. And that at that point, the BC Wine Authority then will sit there and defend the labels of any producers, and we sit there and as Benjamin mentioned, you know, we look after the whole industry. So we look at all the labels that are out there, and we make sure that people are putting the right GIs and sub-GIs. We have all the vineyards in the province registered with us, and they have to identify themselves. So we give them a number, and then they have a grower number that they, when the winery produces that wine, they are identified with that grower number. And so that's how we track where all the grapes are coming from, make sure that they're coming from a specific area, specific sub-GI, so that we know everything is done properly. So it's interesting because, as I said, we're just in the process of really producing the sub-GIs within the province, and it's an exciting time in the wine industry. The winemakers are really interested in identifying their unique areas and being able to put that on their labels. So back to you, Janelle.
Yes, thank you, Scott. I believe that on this one, it really shows the breadth of the work that's going on this topic, and you've spoken just specifically to an exact example in British Columbia of where that work that we were just speaking of is actually underway. and that you're in the middle of sorting this all out with your producers and with your industry here, and looking at probably looking at some of the experiences of the European Union and others who have a lot more experience and have been doing this for a lot longer. So it's interesting to look at how far ahead others are and where we are at with our various processes. So moving on to the next question. This one is for you, Benjamin. And the question is, why is the European Union keen on including geographical indications in its trade negotiations?
Right, indeed, that's a question for me, I guess. Thank you, Janelle, for asking it. I think you have a sense of it as a former negotiator of CETA. First of all, I have to say it's true what you're saying. We do have a big interest in having geographical indications in all of our trade agreements. We have now, I think, 34 agreements, including provisions on geographical indications, 34 running and in force. We have also 2 additional agreements that have been negotiated, concluded, but we are now waiting for the entry to force. And I think there are like 13 negotiations ongoing. So yes, it's part of our trade agenda, definitely. And why is that? Well, I think the answer is simple. It's just, it makes good business sense, right? I mean, geographical indications, it's 15 or 16% of our agri-food exports, and it's growing. So it's not a minor part. It's something that where Europe has something to share. As you know, we see a big demand for our foodstuff and our wines and spirits, and most of that is geographical indications in a sense, where we have the Europe label. So this is basically why. Now, if you want me to elaborate a bit on this, what we're looking after in having these GIs in our trade agreements is, first of all, to have a better protection than what we have under the WTO. As I said, the WTO provides a basic level of protection, a little bit more for wine and spirits, but for foods, it's a basic level. So what we're aiming at is to have an enhanced protection, right, of our GIs. Another point is, actually, we think it's a good idea, not only for us, but also for our trade partners to develop their geographical indication approaches. And that's why we always have an approach that is reciprocal. All right, okay, I mean, I've heard again and again that, well, in CETA, there is no Canadian geographic indications. Well, it's true and it's not completely true. First of all, what was negotiating at the time of CETA, it's true that in CETA there is an annex for food geographical indications, which is empty for Canada. It's true because there was no food GIs protected in Canada at the time when CETA was negotiated. But before CETA, we already had an agreement on wine and spirits, where there is reciprocal protection. We do protect in Europe a number of Canadian wines. I think one that comes to my mind is, I think, Vancouver Island. So we and this old agreement that has been in place since 2004, it is now part of CETA. So in a way, CETA does protect some Canadian geographic indications. But the most important part is that this additional annex that is there in CETA, now empty, it's here to be filled in. So by all means, we're more than open to have more Canadian geographical indications protected in Europe. I mean, that's certainly something we're looking for. The other another element we're looking for in our trade agreements is to make sure that geographical indications are protected in our partner countries without time limits. Because where geographical indications are protected under traditional IP law, usually these rights are limited in time, right, and they have to be applied again, after a certain time has elapsed. This is not something we see for want for geographic indications, and so our agreements are there to stay, and so the protection of GIs under the agreements is there to stay both ways. Again, it's reciprocal. And a last point that we are looking also to obtain through our GI agreements is to handle cases of coexistence of prior trademarks registered in good faith in our partner countries with our geographical indications bearing the same name or approaching names. And this is a very important point that we're not looking after the elimination of those trademarks if they have been registered in good faith, but we are looking for solutions which we put on in our agreements. So I think in a nutshell, that is why it's so important for us in our trade policy to have geographical indications. And on this, back to you, Janelle.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was a very interesting overview, and I agree. Certainly, Canada, it would be good for Canada to develop more geographical indications so that we can have a measure of reciprocity, because the EU has quite a lot of more geographical indications that exist. So they are protected in CETA. There's a long list, and so the more, of course, the framework is set up so that Canada can protect more. So maybe over time we will catch up, and we will have more protected, so that we'll be a little bit more even. We are running a little bit tight on time, I've noticed, and I know that Martin does have a number of things that he was hoping to cover a little bit later in the program. So I'm just going to speed us up a little bit, if that's okay, everyone. And I'd love to move on to the question on how can Canadian producers get their GI recognized in the European Union for exports or in other jurisdictions? And this one is for you, Scott.
Okay. Yeah. We already have a process in place. Actually, there's a agreement with the EU countries that recognizes the both in Ontario the VQA and in British Columbia the BC1 authority as a regulatory authority. So we're allowed to sign the VI1 forms, and that's recognized with the EU countries that they recognize the GIs and sub-GIs that we have in place in BC. So it's sort of an automated process today. It seems to be working. We deal with the federal government to update any information with them. We're also working with the federal government to do sort of a similar process with a number of Asian countries. So we've got a common form that we're working currently to make it expedite, I guess, the exports to Asia. So it's a process in place today within the wine industry. So back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And also more broadly too, for other sectors, we have the Canadian Intellectual Property Office here in Canada, and I know that they're quite active in sharing information with producers on how the process works. And certainly if anyone needed some assistance, they could more than welcome to contact me, and I can put them in touch with whoever needed to be for assistance there. So moving on to, if it's okay, I'll skip you, Benjamin, on this one, just to move us along a little bit faster. I wonder, though, if you could say any comments on, are there many non-EU GIs recognized in the EU and in Canada? Did you have any thoughts that you would like to share on that?
Well, on the EU, I can. Maybe on Canada, I will let it to you. But on the EU, yes, I think I already said we have 1,700 geographical indications that we protect, but which are not European ones. Just to mention on this, there are two ways to get protection in Europe if you're a third country or if you're a GI from another country. The first way is to follow the same way as would European geographical indications, which is to register directly with the Commission. So this you can always do. I won't hide you that it's a painful and quite long process. Of these, we have 200 names of non-EU names which are protected, registered directly in Europe, and the others, the 1,500, they are protected under bilateral agreements like CETA or our wines and spirits agreement. So I think since we have CETA in place between Europe and Canada, I think that's the easiest way for Canadians. So yeah, 1,700 GIs that are not from the EU protected here. In Canada, I mean, I don't know exactly, but I know that you protect a lot of non-EU GIs as well, for sure. From Korea, I think even from the States, you have one GI from the States protected in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. But this is more for you, Janelle.
And I'm afraid I feel like we need to move on to the next question so that we have some time for it, because it's one of our most important questions. So I think I'll just launch into what are the main benefits of GIs for producers, the main benefits and challenges. And so for that, we'll start with Scott.
Yeah, so, as we mentioned before, I think one of the main benefits, obviously, when you have GIs and sub-GIs, it really identifies sort of the quality in the product, and especially in wine, we see a big variance in the price of a bottle of wine depending on where it comes from, which is a huge factor in the price. It's hard for a consumer to know what's in a bottle. It's just a glass bottle with liquid in it, so the label with the GI and sub-GI really are one of the key factors that consumers look at it when they're buying a bottle. So, so price is a main driving factor. In BC, it's still pretty young. I don't know if we've seen the difference with the sub-GIs and GIs with, prices of bottles of wine, but, that's the hope that over time that the consumer will have certain preferences and be willing to pay more for bottles of wine in certain sub-GIs. So I think that's one of the benefits. The others just within the winemakers themselves is that they like to express the area. I mean, for them, part of it is it's the sort of intrinsic value of expressing the soil, the terroir of the wine. So I think it's very important within the industry. The challenge is that you have to use most of the grapes from that area. Our regulations, it has to be 95% of the grapes from a certain sub-GI. So it limits, some of the big producers won't want to use sub-GIs because it limits their method of production. They don't want to have to be handcuffed with that. Some of the smaller producers, it may limit them in what they want to blend for wines and in specific years where they might have difficulty in certain vineyards, it may be a challenge, but that's all part of it though too, is the challenge is also the winemakers enjoy that challenge of every year expresses a different grape and a different taste profile that they like to talk about. So back to you.
Very well said, Scott. Martin, it's up to you now.
Yes, some of the value and benefits we can think of may include aspects that are, of course, economic, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the maintenance of tradition, skills, and knowledge that are embedded in some of these geographical indications. as well as the maintenance of an intangible heritage, such as culture or work habits or production habits. It supports the business development, for example, by protecting the name, serves the IP function that we talked about earlier, as well as guarantee the characteristics of the products, so serves a control function, which is useful both for consumers and the industry as perhaps a promotion lever. And it's part of the portfolio of producers interested to gain in recognition, promotion of product and protection in market development, for example. However, I'd like to bring forward that there are a number of challenges that the value won't go in trees, although it does somewhat. However, working with producer groups in the process of trying to secure a geographic indication, some of the challenges that were identified and put into this analytical framework is the first element at the center is to build a collective vision, mission, and values that pertain to the particular product that those producers will share. Everything rests on that. There's the dimension in the work that has to be done to establish the brand image as well as the promotion that we'll do about that. Perhaps having to plan for market growth if you are being successful with your PGI, to figure out ways to communicate with consumers in various markets that you may want to serve, especially domestic ones, as geographic indications sometimes are less recognized than other distinctive signs. There is a challenge domestically to promote the products with a geographic indication to even local markets. One aspect that everyone takes for given, but is also a challenge, is the institutional framework and partnerships that one have to think about. There is both, the internal environment to the group, but there's also the external institutional environments. For example, there are many government agencies concerned with geographic indications. For example, all the production regulation, marketing of alcoholic products, if we take this example, as well as everything having to do with taxation and revenue. For example, there's the other associations of producers that that you will have to interact with somewhere. There are consumers, for example, in Quebec, the Société des Alcools du Québec, which is a government monopoly that has to become a partner in that process that will perhaps help in promoting your products locally, and as well as your suppliers to be able to secure conformity in inputs and expertise as well as training, and so on and so forth. So those are quite important elements that are challenges for the industry, as well as lower barriers to entry into because once you've formalized this production process and you establish a book of references, then you have to have those observed and controlled, and the industry has to work together in order to come to terms for the book of terms, but amongst themselves as well in terms of what is a quality product and process management that will be part of that. So these are some of the challenges, elements that one have to think about. Back to you, Janelle.
Thank you, Martin. Benjamin, can we move to you now? And I wonder, could you speak a little bit as well about the tourism component of GIS? I don't think we've really touched on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, tourism is definitely something that can be linked to geographical indications, in the sense that geographical indications, of course, refer to a territory, and depending on your product and your territory, possibly you will have a story to tell that will make in the spirit of your consumers, it will create a strong link between what the product they enjoy at home and the region where you're from. I mean, if you remember my story of Darjeeling, myself as a tourist in Darjeeling a few years ago, being an amateur of Darjeeling tea, I really had to visit the tea plantations there. It was, I couldn't go there and not visit those plantations. And by the way, I mean, or perhaps also I've selected these destinations because of the tea plantations. Although what I wanted to do is not drink tea, but hike in mountains, right? So, and I'm not the only one, right? There are plenty of examples. I think what is important is when you go for establishing a GI, as I said, it has to be part of a collective plan, and tourism definitely can be part of this collective plan. And I think it's also a reason why in Europe we have such a strong role also of authorities in the development and protection of geographic indications, because we see there a value not only for producers, but also for the region, the local communities around them. And I think this is indeed a very, very important and very relevant point like you're making on tourism. Thank you for that, Janelle.
My pleasure. And I think where it hits home for me is when we talk about protecting Vancouver Island as a name. But if I think about all the different subregions of Vancouver Island and how important they are for tourism, something like Tofino, if you've ever been, I mean, it's a very important destination for tourism, and so it is definitely part of the conversation. Irene, do you have anything that you would like to add to this question?
I personally think it's a very relevant topic, because we have seen a lot of, being Italian, it's been long the tradition. People go to Tuscany. They go to Tuscany because they like to drink wine and they like good food and the sceneries. But there is an increased gastronomic and wine trails, coffee trails, tea trails, you name it, depending on, what people like to do. Search for origin and search for special products in a world of mass-produced things is becoming more and more a thing. And that creates a lot of spillover. So here's where geographic indications are relevant for producers, but also as policy leverage and as economic tools, because they don't only benefit the community that has that one GI. They benefit the service economy, the transportation economy. They benefit the tourism economy when people go and visit the region. Then there is the infrastructure that has to be built. There is, the internet that has to go to those hotels. There is additional, people go for wine, but they're going to eat some other products. And so you can have a joint series of GIs, you can have adjacent products, so you can have a lot of, what in economics terms we say positive spillovers. Now, the issue is, though, too much success can actually become a problem, because there is too many people who want to go into a place, and then there is a strong pressure on demand, and the place might not be well organized for that, and it shouldn't really take too many people at once. So, that's one of the main problems of GIs. It's how you balance it's always a long-term strategy. You should never allow short-term gains to become the driver versus long-term quality, sustainability, avoiding to have too many tourism, too much production and so on, because that is actually can easily go out of hand. And we have many examples when GI are poorly managed that they actually do more harm than good. These are thankfully few examples, but the management of the society, so that the association and the ecosystem is absolutely crucial. So these are economic tools. They can help a lot of the economy, particularly in countries that heavily rely on tourism or heavily rely on agri-tourism. but the important thing is to keep the place without too many people. Now, it's not a problem now, but now you have a lot of, and then it goes into the cooking shows, into the travel, your documentaries, and so you have all these. Now we can travel in real person, much more difficult, so we travel online, and so you have all that can also become another way to do business through geographic indications. But the management that are not diluting your image as a GI is also very important as well.
Fantastic. I'm sorry, I started to think of myself on the beaches of the Adriatic Sea, sipping some Prosecco as you were talking. So I need to focus. We are almost out of time. And Martin, I would like to move to you now for the final question and to respond to the final question with your slide, if that's all right. We'll move over to the final question. What are the spillover effects of GIs? And after you answer, we'll move quickly to a Q&A session, because I see some really interesting questions here that I do want to get to. We only have about 20 minutes left of the session. So Martin, if you could just bring us home with your next response, and then I'll quickly close it and we'll move to Q&A.
Well, I think that the one important element to wrap this up and think of it as economic benefits and spillover effects is to look at some of the key success factors as antecedents for that to happen. You know, the success of collective distinctive signs requires a thoughtful process, and it's important to understand that the economic value will not emerge on its own. And one wants to take deliberate action about that. So one, I guess, piece of wisdom is not to think of the obtention of a designated distinctive sign as an end in itself for a producer group, but perhaps rather as a collective enterprise, such as a startup, to grow, or even to as a collective business model. There's the individual businesses, but also the collective one that has to be managed, has to be grown, has to have a strategic plan. So therefore, think of it as a lever for business development in a region or a territory. So some of these elements that came out of working with producer groups and interviews with people in agencies looking over at GIs here and internationally, one of the key elements is to have visionary leaders that will act as champions for carrying the case. Oftentimes, when those individuals aren't there, the case isn't moving forward, and that's quite important. It's important also to generate a collective dynamics. That ties back to my previous slide, to think about the organization of the sector, the resources that have to be input into it, as well as a transparency process. The motivation behind it, the adherence to collective value, for example, the mobilization of everyone, the specification of terms, as well as the public consultation process. There's the governance. Irene alluded a bit to that in the medium as well as long term, because getting the recognition for GI is perhaps the initial point from which to depart in order to make it viable. And think about product strength, for example, both at the individual level as well as in terms of collective strategies, figuring out how to finance that, for example. The compliance with all regulations, and they are numerous, for example, in the alcohol sector as well as in the food sector. For example, in Quebec, there are many rules and regulations related to alcohol permits and different ways that products can be produced with all the intricacies, as well as concerns for food safety for the many GIs having to do with food. And then one key element is the recognition by consumers, both locally as well as internationally. Of course, it's been alluded to. Tourism is one that comes to mind as really important ingredient in the mix. It helps create a emotional connection with a product and perhaps with the region where the products come from. And those could be sources of important spillovers that will generate effects much beyond the productive itself. So from an economic standpoint, one could look at all this mix of tangible and intangible elements. And of course, the spillover effects, and Irene alluded to some of that earlier, in more formal terms, creating direct, indirect, as well as induced effects in terms, for example, of gross domestic product, job created locally. So if you buy locally, you create economic activity locally, which is much bigger than the geographic indication itself, if those key success factors are met, for example. So back to you, Janelle.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think you did a wonderful job of, of bringing it really together there for us at the end, and we are absolutely now out of time for what we allotted to answer these questions, and I think we've covered a lot of interesting territory for folks here. I think in general we've talked about the importance of raising awareness of the opportunities of GIs and how producers may go about doing it, who they need to talk to and reach out to, and some of the pros and cons, things to think about. I certainly learned a lot myself as well from you, so thank you very much for sharing. And I think if we could just quickly move to some of these questions here that we have, that would be fantastic. So I noticed we had a question here around, let's see if I can go to the first one. At what point does a GI, at what point does a GI go from informal to formal? So the example is BC grown, Okanagan Valley, etc., to a certified protected GI. Is the VQA an example of a certified protected GI, and what are other examples of certified protected GIs that exist in British Columbia? Scott, do you mind touching on that?
Yeah, so yeah, the BC VQA program, that is the program to certify the GIs and sub-GIs. So any wines that want to put on a GI or sub-GI on their bottles, on their labels, have to go through our office, and we review, not only do we do a taste panel with them, but we review the label, we review where the wines, or where the grapes are coming from, to certify the GI. So, and I think, I don't know about the rest of BC, but I think, yeah, that we're probably the only authority in BC doing GIs and sub-GIs at this point. I don't think there's any food GIs, but I don't know if you know about that, Janelle.
Yeah, yeah, I know that also in British Columbia we have our Ministry of Agriculture that has the ability. They actually protect a number of GIs through the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, and that's just protection in Canada, though. So, you know, of course, I guess it would be very important for producers to think about how to protect them in other jurisdictions. So I wonder if anyone could speak to this next question. Is there an estimate of what it costs in time and budget to establish a GI, and are there any examples? Would anyone like to offer to respond to that one? Scott?
I can talk to the wine industry in the sense that I guess it's a process that's been in place, and so it actually the cost of it isn't that high. Like currently, the wineries are paying probably $3,000 to $5,000 to set up a sub GI, and so the cost of it is fairly low. Most of the other costs are through our office and the Minister of Agriculture.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add at this point to that, the cost, the general cost? I note that in our next session, which is taking place May 20th. So I'll just mention that again to everyone on the line. We really hope that you will join us for the next session. And that is when we will have an opportunity to cover off some of these other questions in terms of the cost and how that would work. And so I think now would be a good time for us to close the session and allow one more opportunity for my esteemed experts to say anything more that they have on their minds that they might like to share before we say goodbye. Anyone? Benjamin.
Yes, maybe one point, just thinking also of what has been discussed right now. If you want to get protection in Europe, there is one important step that you must go before, is to get protection domestically in your own country. Okay, that will be the first thing that we will look at. Whatever the path you follow for protection in Europe of a geographical indication, be it direct registration with the Commission or through the CETA agreement, you will have to be protected in Canada, right? So this is very important. It's the first and most important step. On the cost, I can say one little thing on the cost. To get registration in Europe, there is no fee. We take the cost, the administrative cost is on us, right? But of course, the cost to prepare the files is on the shoulders of the producers. That would be it. But by all means, please do, make your story, make your product a GI and seek protection in Europe. I mean, by all means, we would love to have more Canadian GIs and more Canadian stories to be told through these GIs in Europe. I think it would be really great. So thank you for this discussion. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you all.
Martin, I noticed that we didn't fully answer the question that Scott asked about other Canadian GIs that are protected. I believe under CETA, we do not have any protections for cheese or any other food from British Columbia, but from Quebec, I would think that there may be. So I was wondering if you have any comments or knowledge around that.
To my knowledge, there's not been automatic recognition of the GIs certified by Quebec. They would have to be recognized as part of the Canadian agreement, and to my knowledge, but this may have changed, I don't believe they were included as part of the CETA agreement for the time being. But there is a parallel process by which it can be recognized in the EU. But I don't know if any producer group have gone that way yet to get it recognized so far. There was perhaps another element that was brought forward in one of the questions, the idea that GIs seem to be prevalent for alcoholic beverages mostly. But I just want to reemphasize that in Quebec, as part of the CAR-TV process, there's been, the Canadian cow cheese, also the Charlevoix lamb. Charlevoix is a region in the North Shore in eastern Quebec, and as well as the Neuville sweet corn PGIs. So there are other types of PGIs or GIs that have other aspects than alcoholic beverages. So just to reemphasize that aspect.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. I think that's very important as well. Okay, well, I would like to extend my warm thank you to everyone for joining us here today, and to the EU for organizing this event again. And I think it's been an excellent way to raise awareness of this important issue and to share some information. And so thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day.
Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.